The throne was a masterwork of gilded oak and velvet, but to Queen Isolde, it felt like a cage of cold, unforgiving iron, from its imposing height. She surveyed the afternoon court, a living tapestry of silk and ambition woven through the cavernous hall. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed through the towering arched windows, catching the glint of jewels on noble throats and the polished marble floors. The air hummed with a low, polite murmur, a symphony of whispered politics and rustling gowns, all underscored by the distant, melodic trickle of water from the courtyard fountains. The scent of beeswax candles, exotic perfumes, and the faint, sweet aroma of summer blossoms from the open terrace was almost cloying in its richness. Her gaze, however, was not on the obsequious courtiers or the lavish displays of wealth. It was drawn as if by a lodestone to the far side of the room. There, leaning against a pillar of veined alabaster, stood her son, Prince Theron. His posture was one of casual indifference, but his eyes, the same piercing blue as his father's, were anything but. They were fixed on her, calculating and cold, missing nothing. They assessed the weight of the crown upon her brow, the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted a goblet, the weary slope of her shoulders beneath the heavy ceremonial robes. In his stare, she felt the immense, crushing weight of her station, a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. The laughter of the court, the vibrant hues of the tapestries depicting glorious histories, the very opulence that surrounded her. It all seemed to recede, leaving her isolated on her island of gold, with the chilling waters of her son's ambitions slowly rising to claim her. The memory came unbidden, a sudden warmth in the chill of the council chamber. It was a simple thing, a fragment of time from a dozen years past. Theron, no taller than her waist, his small hand trustingly tucked in hers as they walked the palace gardens. He had been chasing a butterfly, his laughter like the clear ringing of bells, pure and unburdened. He had tripped, scraping his knee on the gravel path, and she had knelt, soothing his tears with a gentle touch and a whispered promise that all would be well. The boy who had looked up at her then, his eyes wide with faith, and love seemed a world away from the man who now sat across from her at the heavy oak table. That man, her son, lounged in his high-backed chair with an indolent grace that felt practiced. His fingers steepled before him, he listened to Lord Mace, a man whose lands were vast and whose hunger for influence was a poorly kept secret. Isolde watched as Theron gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to something Mace murmured, a silent accord passing between them that sent a cold trickle of apprehension down her spine. It was not the first such alliance she had noticed. Over recent months, Theron had been drawing closer to the most ambitious, least scrupulous members of her court lords, who spoke of expansion and strong rule, who looked at her reign of careful diplomacy and saw only weakness. The council droned on, a debate over grain tariffs from the southern provinces. The words washed over Isolde, losing all meaning as her unease solidified into a hard, cold knot in her stomach. She studied her son's profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the cool detachment in his gaze as he surveyed the other lords. This was not the boy who had cried over a scraped knee. This was a stranger wearing her son's face, a prince sharpening his claws on the very foundations of her rule. The lavish room with its maps and treaties seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick and difficult to breathe. Every glance Theron exchanged with Mace, every subtle gesture of understanding, felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of the past, sealing away the memory of the trusting child and confirming the terrifying reality of the calculating man he had become. The polished mahogany doors of the prince's solar closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, sealing Isolde in the opulent chamber with the source of her disquiet. Theron stood before a bank of leaded glass windows, the afternoon sun casting his long, elegant shadow across the intricate Myrish carpet. He turned, a practiced smile gracing his lips. But it did not reach his eyes, which remained as cool and assessing as polished river stones. She did not mince words. The maternal warmth she had once wielded like a shield now hardened into a queen's directness. She spoke of the alliances she had observed, whispered counsels with men of dubious loyalty, the subtle shifts in power that felt less like political maneuvering and more like the quiet drawing of a blade. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of a fear she could no longer suppress. Theron listened with an air of indulgent patience, a master performer awaiting his cue. When she finished, he gave a light, dismissive laugh that chilled her more than any outburst of anger could have. He spoke of a son's duty to understand the machinations of the court, to learn the landscape of power from those who navigated it best. His words were smooth as oil, each one crafted to soothe and deflect. He spoke of strengthening her reign, of preparing himself to be a worthy successor someday, far in the future. He painted a picture of filial devotion so convincing that, for a fleeting moment, the ghost of the boy in the garden seemed to flicker behind his eyes. But the moment passed. The smile was too perfect, the explanations too glib. The cold calculation in his gaze never wavered. Her heart, a traitorous organ that still yearned to believe, clenched painfully. The love she bore him warred with the icy certainty growing in her soul. He was lying. The realization was a shard of glass in her chest. Later, in the seclusion of her own chambers, with the scent of her fading perfume hanging in the air, she sent for Captain Vallon. The grizzled guardsman had served her since before Theron was born, his loyalty as steadfast as the ancient stone of the palace walls. When he arrived, she issued her command in a low, unwavering tone, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. He was to watch the prince, discreetly, report on his movements, his meetings, his nocturnal wanderings, every detail. As Captain Vallon bowed and withdrew, a profound and aching guilt settled over Isolde, a heavy mantle she had not asked for. It whispered that she was betraying her own child, succumbing to paranoia, seeing monsters in the shadows of her making. She stood alone, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than ever, and made a conscious, painful choice. She wrapped the guilt in layers of cold, hard necessity and locked it away in a distant corner of her heart. A queen's duty, she told herself, must outweigh a mother's hope. The doubt had crystallized into resolve, and she would follow its cold light, no matter where it led. The great hall shimmered with a deceptive warmth. 1,000 candles reflected in polished silver and the jeweled goblets of the realm's most powerful nobles. Music swelled from the minstrel's gallery, a lively tune meant to signify celebration and unity, yet the air thrummed with attention. Isolde could feel humming beneath her skin like a plucked harp string. She sat at the high table, a figure of carved composure, her crimson gown a splash of blood against the pale stone of her throne-like chair. The feast was a spectacle of excess succulent roasted swans adorned with their own feathers. Glistening boars with apples in their mouths, rivers of wine poured from jeweled decanters. It was all a beautiful, fragrant lie. Her eyes, as ever, found Theron. He moved through the throng with an easy, charming grace, clapping lords on the shoulder, sharing a quiet word that drew laughter, the very image of the beloved prince. He had not looked at her all evening, a pointed omission that felt louder than any proclamation. Then, as the third course was cleared, he turned. His gaze met hers across the length of the hall, and for a heartbeat the mask of the charming prince slipped, replaced by something unreadable and intense. He picked up a heavy golden goblet, the one reserved for the monarch, and a servant hurried forward to fill it with deep red wine from a pitcher that seemed to catch no light. He began to walk toward her, the crowd parting before him. Every eye in the hall followed his progress, the music seeming to soften in deference. Isolde's breath caught in her throat. This was a public gesture, a son approaching his queen mother. But it was also Theron, whose cold ambition had kept her awake for nights, whose lies had prompted her to order his surveillance. Guard Captain Vallon watched from the shadows, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, a silent sentinel of her doubt. Theron reached the dais and ascended the steps. He did not kneel, but bowed his head slightly, a perfect performance of respectful deference. He extended the goblet to her. The wine within was the color of a deep old wound. "A toast," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest, a smooth, resonant baritone that promised sincerity. "To the health of our queen, to a long and prosperous reign." His eyes, now that he was close, held hers. They were not the cold, calculating eyes from the council chamber, nor the defiant ones from his solar. They were soft, almost pleading. They were the eyes of the boy in the garden, asking for her trust one more time. The carefully constructed walls of her suspicion, the resolve she had fortified with cold necessity, crumbled under that gaze. The guilt she had locked away surged forth, whispering that she had been wrong, that a mother's hope was not a weakness but a truth, a fragile, Desperate warmth bloomed in her chest. This was her son, her Theron, their fingers brushing against his. His skin was cool. She offered him a tremulous smile, a queen's gratitude, and a mother's forgiveness blended into one. She raised the chalice high for the court to see, then brought it to her lips. The wine was rich and spiced, with a faint, bitter undertone she mistook for the oak of the cask. She drank deeply, the liquid a welcome warmth spreading through her. As she lowered the goblet, her eyes glistened with unshed tears of relief. She did not see the faint, fleeting smile that touched Theron's lips as he bowed again and retreated back into the crowd. It was a smile of perfect, chilling triumph, there and gone in an instant, lost to all but the shadows that now seemed to cling more tightly to the edges of the hall. The warmth of the wine and the glow of false reconciliation carried Isolde from the hall, her steps light, her heart unburdened for the first time in months. The grand feast faded behind her, its music and laughter muffled by the thick tapestries and stone corridors that led to the royal apartments. Her chambers welcomed her with familiar, scent-dried lavender from the sachets in her wardrobes. The beeswax used on the dark wood furniture, the faint, clean smell of the cold night air drifting through the slightly open window. She dismissed her ladies with a soft word, craving solitude to cradle the fragile hope Theron had seemingly returned to her. Alone, she stood before her dressing mirror, unpinning the heavy crown from her hair. The weight lifted, a physical echo of the emotional unburdening she felt. She studied her reflection, the fine lines at the eyes, the weariness that usually haunted her gaze now softened into something like peace. She ran a hand over the rich fabric of her gown, a final remnant of the evening spectacle, and a small contented sigh escaped her. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps the shadows she saw were only a mother's fear of losing her child to the world. The first twinge was a small, sharp thing, a sudden cramp low in her abdomen. She paused, her hands stilling on the fabric. It was nothing, she told herself. The rich, spiced food, the heady wine, the excitement of the evening, her stomach was merely protesting the excess. She moved to the window, seeking the cool air to soothe the sudden faint nausea that accompanied the pain. Below, the palace gardens were silvered in moonlight, a scene of perfect, peaceful stillness. But the pain did not subside. It intensified, coiling tighter, a hot, insistent knot that stole her breath. She gripped the cold stone of the windowsill, her knuckles whitening. Another cramp, deeper this time, wrenched a soft gasp from her. This was no simple indigestion. Cold dread, entirely separate from the heat blooming in her gut, began to prickle at the base of her skull. As the agony mounted, her mind, seeking refuge, fractured. The opulent bedchamber dissolved, replaced by the sun-dappled shade of the garden from a lifetime ago. She saw Theron not as the man in the hall, but as a small boy of 6, his face smudged with dirt, cradling a fallen fledgling in his cupped hands with a tenderness that had brought tears to her eyes. His small voice, high and earnest, asking her if she could make it better. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel the warmth of that lost son on her skin, a stark contrast to the cold sweat now beading on her brow. The vision shattered as another wave of pain crashed over her, doubling her over. She stumbled toward her bed, her legs unsteady. She collapsed onto the silken coverlet, her body curling instinctively around the searing torment in her core. Her breath came in short, ragged pants. Another flashback seized Theron at 10, feverish and trembling, his small hand clutching hers through a long, terrifying night as she bathed his brow and whispered promises of dawn. She had fought for him then, a lioness guarding her cub. Now, a different kind of fever was claiming her, one born not of illness but of a bitter, unthinkable truth that her reeling mind still refused to fully grasp. The loving boy of her memories was a ghost, haunting the edges of the excruciating present, his past kindness a cruel mockery of the poison now coursing through her veins. The world had shrunk to the 4 corners of her bed, and the searing fire in her belly. Isolde's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one a small agony. The silken sheets were damp with cold sweat, clinging to her skin like a shroud. The opulent room, once her sanctuary, now seemed to tilt and sway, the dancing firelight casting monstrous, leaping shadows on the tapestried walls. Between waves of nausea and cramping, her mind flailed. a drowning thing grasping at fragments of the past Theron's childhood laughter. His small hand in hers, the trusting look in his eyes. Each memory was a fresh wound, a beautiful lie that made the present torment all the more profane. The door opened with a soft creak, and a figure moved swiftly to her side. Through a haze of pain, she recognized the lined, concerned face of Master Cade, her physician for 30 years. His hands, gentle and capable, felt her forehead, then her wrist. His fingers seeking the frantic, thready pulse that fluttered like a trapped bird. His expression, usually one of calm competence, shifted to one of deep, horrified gravity. He leaned closer, his nose wrinkling slightly as he caught her breath. His eyes widened imperceptibly, and he drew back, his face ashen. He did not need to speak the words. The truth was in the pity and terror in his old eyes, in the way his hands trembled as he mixed a draught from his satchel knot, a cure. She understood with sudden chilling clarity, but a mere palliative, something to dull the edge of a blade that had already found its mark. The bitter undertone in the wine she had mistaken for oak. It had been wolfsbane, or nightshade, or some other vile essence designed to mimic a natural death. To work its evil slowly, so none would suspect the golden prince who had served it with a smile. The revelation did not come as a shock. It was a final, brutal settling, a last piece of a terrible puzzle clicking into place with deafening finality. The cold ambition in his eyes, the alliances with vipers, the smooth, practiced Lysit had all been leading here. To this bed, to this pain. Her own son. He had chosen the poison, procured it, and offered it to her in a cup of reconciliation, using the ghost of her love for him as the perfect vessel for his betrayal. A final, immense strength, drawn from the very depths of her despair and fury, surged through her. She gripped Cade's arm, her fingers like talons. He has crowned himself. With poison, she breathed, her eyes burning with a terrible light. My blood is his. First decree, she fell back against the pillows, her strength spent. She saw it all: Theron on the throne, the court cowed, her legacy erased, her kingdom becoming a fiefdom of his cold greed. Yet a final profound bitterness, colder than the grave, filled her. With the last vestige of her breath, she shaped the words, a low, guttural curse that seemed to suck the warmth from the very air. It was not a plea to the gods, but a command from a queen who had been murdered in her own home. Let every stone of this palace, every ear of grain in his fields, remember me. Let his crown be a band of ice, and his triumph a feast. Then Queen Isolde stilled, her eyes open and fixed on some distant, unseen point, her face a mask of betrayed love and unleashed vengeance. The silence that had swallowed the queen's chambers did not last. Prince Theron did not walk the halls that morning. He processed through them, a somber specter at the head of a column of his most loyal guards. They moved with purpose, a silent, spreading stain of intent, taking up positions at every major junction, every doorway leading to the heart of power. The great bell of the citadel began to toll a single, mournful note that rolled across the waking city and echoed through the palace's stone bones. It was not the rapid, frantic peal of alarm, but the slow, measured rhythm of passing, each resonant strike a hammer blow against the heart of the realm. Courtiers and servants, roused from their beds by the ominous sound, gathered in the throne room, their faces pale with sleep and dawning dread. Then he appeared. Theron ascended the dais, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the hushed hall. He had dressed not in the vibrant silks of a prince, but in stark, unadorned black, a costume of grief so perfect it felt like a mockery. He paused before the empty throne, letting the final toll of the bell fade into a silence so absolute one could hear the nervous rustle of a gown from the back of the crowd. His voice, when it came, was low and thick with what sounded like unspeakable sorrow, a masterful performance that carried to every corner of the vast room. He spoke of a great tragedy, a sudden and devastating illness that had stolen their beloved queen from them in the night. He spoke of her strength, her wisdom, her love for the kingdom, all the things he had secretly scorned. In this hour of profound loss, he declared, the kingdom could not stand leaderless, vulnerable to the wolves that circled every crown. The line of succession was clear. The stability of the realm was paramount. The coronation would proceed before the sun reached its zenith. But the sound died as quickly as it was born. Their cold, unwavering stares swept over the crowd, a silent, lethal promise. The court was silenced, not by grief, but by fear. But behind the facade of tragic resolve, behind the performance of a heartbroken son, reluctantly accepting a heavy burden, a fire of pure unadulterated triumph blazed. The throne was his, the kingdom was his. Every bowed head, every fearful glance, was a tribute to his flawless design. He had one. And the first and greatest obstacle to his power now lay cold and still in her chambers. Her final curse, nothing but the ravings of a dying woman, to be forgotten. He allowed himself a single, inward smile, a secret celebration in the quiet theater of his mind. The sun's crown was finally his. The coronation proceeded with a chilling, mechanical precision, a ceremony stripped of its customary joy and reverence. The high priest's voice trembled slightly as he recited the ancient rites, his eyes darting nervously toward the stone-faced guards who flanked the dais. The sacred oils used to anoint Theron's brow seemed to lack their usual fragrant warmth, feeling instead like a cold, slick brand. When the heavy jeweled crown was finally lowered onto his head, the weight of it was the only thing that felt real to him, a solid, satisfying pressure that confirmed his absolute victory. The assembled nobles offered a muted, scattered applause that was quickly swallowed by the vast, watchful silence of the hall. There were no cheers, only the hollow echo of gloved hands meeting in perfunctory rhythm, a sound like distant, failing rain.
Ow.
No sooner had the crown settled than Theron began to speak, his voice now devoid of its earlier feigned grief, replaced by a cold, clear authority that brooked no dissent. He issued his first decrees, not as proposals, but as immutable law. Lord Mace, his sycophantic ally, was named Hand of the King, a move that drew sharp, indrawn breaths from the older courtiers. Then came the dismissals. One by one, Isolda's most trusted advisors, men and women of experience and cautious wisdom, were stripped of their titles and positions. Their protests were met with a flat, icy stare and a gesture from Theron that prompted the guards to step forward, their presence a silent, physical period at the end of every sentence. They were not merely dismissed, they were escorted from the hall, their decades of service erased in a moment by the whim of a boy king drunk on his own power. A palpable tension thickened the air, a mixture of fear, outrage, and stunned disbelief. The new king's ruthlessness was not a slow unveiling, but a brutal, immediate unveiling. As the dismissed lords were marched out, their humiliation, a stark warning to all who remained, the first true whispers of dissent began to surface. They were not loud, not yet. They were the faintest rustle of silk as two courtiers leaned closer together in a shadowed alcove. The almost imperceptible shake of a head from an older baron, the meaningful, fearful glance exchanged between two ladies of a house that had long been loyal to Isolde. They were the seeds of rebellion, planted in the cold, hard ground of fear, waiting for the right moment to crack through the surface. The crown was on Theron's head, but the throne beneath him felt less like a seat of power and more like the epicenter of a coming storm. A creeping wrongness began to seep through the palace stones, a subtle corruption that defied all reason. It started in the kitchens, where a platter of freshly roasted pheasants, still steaming from the ovens, was carried into the great hall, as the server placed it before the new king. The golden-brown skin visibly grayed and shriveled, the rich aroma of herbs and fat curdling in an instant into the stench of putrid decay. Theron stared, his fork poised in midair, as the meat collapsed into a swarm of glistening maggots before the horrified eyes of the court. The same fate befell the bread, the cheese, the wine. Anything meant for the king's table spoiled the moment it was set before him. While the plates of his courtiers remained untouched and wholesome, the royal kitchens, once the heart of the palace's bounty, became a place of frantic, futile activity and whispered terror. The very light within the palace seemed to grow thin and sickly. A perpetual, bone-deep chill took root in the corridors, a cold that no number of roaring hearths could dispel. It was a damp, clinging cold that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves, and the shadows they moved. From the corner of the eye they would twitch and coil like living things, retreating into nothingness when stared at directly. Courtiers hurried through the halls with hunched shoulders, refusing to look left or right, their nervous laughter dying in throats tight with a fear they could not name. Servants who knew the rhythms of the palace better than anyone were the first to give voice to the dread. Their whispers slithered from the sculleries and the laundries, from behind tapestries and half-closed doors. They spoke of a mother's wrath, of a dying curse spoken in a room that now stood locked and silent. They said the queen was not gone, that her fury was seeping up from the stones she had loved, and that the palace itself was beginning to remember its true mistress. The gilded cage was now a haunted ruin, and its new master sat upon a throne that grew colder with every passing hour. The king's favorite hound, a massive brindle mastiff named Burrow, was a creature of pure, uncomplicated loyalty. He had been Theron's constant companion since he was a boy, steadfast presence through the long, isolating years of his princely education. Even as Theron's heart had hardened and his ambitions had twisted, Bor's devotion had never wavered. The hound would lay at the foot of the new king's throne, a warm, breathing anchor in the increasingly frigid and hostile atmosphere of the court. His simple, trusting presence was one of the few things that seemed immune to the creeping malaise that had gripped the palace. They found him at dawn in the small private courtyard, where Theron often took his morning air. The king had been growing impatient for his companion's familiar, padding footsteps. Instead, a page's scream tore through the morning's uneasy quiet. Burrow lay on his side on the cold flagstones, his powerful body rigid, his lips pulled back from his teeth in a final silent snarl. His eyes were wide open, clouded with the milky film of death. But it was not the sight of the dead animal that stilled the breath in every throat. It was what was carved into the smooth stone beneath his head. Freshly scored into the granite, as if by a white-hot blade, was a series of intricate, interlocking symbols. They were angular and alien, a language of sharp lines and cruel curves that seemed to writhe in the weak morning light. They were a perfect, horrifying match to the marks the queen's own trembling finger had traced into her bedsheet in her final, agonized moments, the same symbols her physician had described in a hushed, terrified whisper to the few he still trusted. A wave of pure, undiluted panic broke over the small gathering of guards and servants. The whispered theories of a curse, once confined to the shadows, now had a bloody, undeniable testament. It was no longer just spoiled food and shifting shadows. The queen's vengeance had claimed its first life, and it had chosen not a lord or a guard, but the king's own beloved hound, a creature of innocence, in a court drowning in guilt. The message was chillingly specific, cruelly personal. It was not a blind wrath sweeping the palace. It was a targeted, intelligent malice, and it had begun its work by taking from the king the one thing that had loved him without condition. The silent, terrified looks that passed between the courtiers that day were no longer just of fear, but of a dawning, horrific certainty. The curse was real. It was walking among them, and it was just beginning. It began as a faint, almost melodic hum, a thread of sound so delicate it could be mistaken for the wind sighing through a cracked window or the distant murmur of the sea. But there was no wind that still, oppressive night, and the sea was leagues away. A young scullery maid, hurrying down a deserted corridor with an armful of linens, was the first to hear it clearly. She froze, her blood turning to ice. It was a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful. Humming a lullaby she remembered the queen singing to the prince when he was small. The sound seemed to emanate from the very stones of the wall beside her, a vibration in the ancient mortar. She dropped the linens and fled, her footsteps echoing like frantic heartbeats in the silence. She was not the last. Within days, reports flooded the guard posts, always from empty corridors, always after dark. Courtiers, servants, even hardened soldiers spoke of hearing it, a whisper that was not quite a word. A fragment of a song half remembered, a sigh that carried the faint floral scent of the queen's favorite perfume. It was never loud, never threatening in its tone, but its implications were terrifying. It was a voice from the grave, woven into the fabric of the palace itself, a constant, gentle reminder of the crime that festered at its heart. Theron dismissed each report with cold contempt, branding the witnesses as superstitious fools or, worse, traitors seeking to undermine his rule with ghost stories. He doubled the guards and ordered any servant caught spreading such tales to be whipped. Publicly, he was a bastion of rationality, a a king who would not be swayed by the fearful mutterings of his inferiors. But in the privacy of his chambers, as night fell and the palace grew quiet, a different man emerged. The silence itself became his enemy, a blank canvas upon which his own mind painted its horrors. His sleep, once deep and untroubled by conscience, became a battleground. The moment he closed his eyes, he was back in her chambers. He saw not the proud queen, but his mother, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her eyes wide with betrayal, and a love turned to ash fixed on him. In the dreams he was not the powerful king but a boy again, standing helplessly by the bed as she pointed a trembling accusatory finger. She never spoke, but the condemnation in her gaze was a physical weight, crushing the breath from his lungs. He would wake gasping, the sheets tangled around him, the echo of her silent scream ringing in his ears. The whispers of the walls were bad enough, but the screams in his own mind were a torture no decree could silence. The curse, having seated its terror within the palace walls, now spilled beyond them, a creeping sickness upon the very land that had once prospered under Isolda's careful hand. The first reports arrived not from panicked courtiers, but from grim-faced messengers whose dusty cloaks and weary eyes spoke of hard rides from the outlying provinces. They brought word not of rebellion, but of a deeper, more fundamental decay. In the fertile valleys and rolling farmlands whose lords had been first to swear fealty to the new king, the blight had taken root. It was a silent, creeping death. Wheat and barley, weeks from harvest, and heavy with promise, withered in the span of a single moonless night. The stalks did not simply brown and die. They blackened and crumbled to dust at the faintest touch, as if all vitality had been sucked from them by an unseen, ravenous mouth. In the pastures, livestock, fat cattle, and sturdy sheep began to sicken. They dropped in their tracks, their bodies bloated, and their eyes clouded with the same milky film that had stolen the sight of the king's hound. The earth itself in these regions seemed to sour, yielding a stench of rot and desolation that hung in the air like a shroud. Yet the horror was not universal. It was meticulously, terrifyingly selective. Messengers from the northern holds and the eastern marches. Regions whose lords had hesitated to pledge to Theron, or had openly wept at Isolda's funeral, reported no such afflictions. Their fields remained golden under the sun, their herds healthy and robust. The boundary between blight and bounty was not drawn by river or mountain, but by loyalty. The curse was a cartographer of vengeance, its map drawn in blighted soil and the corpses of cattle. And it delineated with brutal clarity the lands that had embraced the usurper king. Theories once whispered now became shouted certainties in the taverns and market squares. The queen's curse was no longer a phantom story to frighten children. It was a tangible force, a divine judgment that could wither a field and starve a nation. It did not strike at the king directly, but at the foundation of his power, the bread on his subjects' tables, the wealth in his coffers. Those who had supported Theron now looked upon their dying fields and their failing livestock with a new, gut-wrenching fear. Their loyalty had purchased them not favor, but famine. They had traded a queen's gentle prosperity for a king's cursed reign, and the land itself was exacting the price. The throne room, once a place of light and law, now felt like a mausoleum waiting for its next occupant. The air was thick with the unspoken terror of the blight, the whispered voice in the stones, the memory of the dead hound. King Theron sat upon his cold throne, his face a carefully composed mask of bored authority, but the tension in his jaw and the restless tapping of his fingers on the gilded armrest betrayed the fraying edges of his control. The court was a sea of pale, nervous faces, each noble and servant alike, calculating the risk of every breath, every glance. Then Lord Valerius stepped forward. He was an old man, his back stooped from a lifetime of service, his face a roadmap of loyalty and care. He had been Isolda's oldest friend, her most trusted advisor since before Theron was born, a man known for his quiet wisdom and unwavering integrity. It remained silent through the coronation, through the dismissals, through the mounting strangeness, a statue of grief and disapproval. But now, as the reports of the selective blight solidified the court's deepest fears, his silence broke. His voice, though aged, did not tremble. It rang out in the stifling quiet, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. He did not speak in riddles or illusions. He named the crime directly, his words falling into the silence like stones into a still pond. He accused Theron of regicide, spoke of the queen's love, her trust, the goblet offered in false reconciliation. He laid out the sequence of events not as conjecture, but as undeniable truth, his old eyes burning with a fire that had been banked for too long. He called the blight and the hauntings not a curse, but justice, the land itself recoiling from a king crowned with his mother's blood. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. This was not a whisper in a shadowed corner. This was a declaration of war spoken at the foot of the throne itself. Theron's mask of boredom shattered. His face flushed a mottled red, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, incandescent rage. He shot to his feet, his finger stabbing toward the old lord. Treason. The word was a venomous shout echoing off the stone walls. You spew poisonous lies. Guards, seize this traitor. Throw him in the blackest cell beneath the palace. The guards, their loyalty purchased with gold and fear, moved instantly. They surged forward, their armor clanking, hands reaching for Lord Valerius. The court watched, frozen in a tableau of horror, expecting the old man to be dragged away, his defiance ending in the dungeons. But as the guard's hands were about to close on his arms, a strange thing happened. The torches lining the walls flickered violently, not as if in a draft, but in a sudden synchronized gasp. A wave of that now familiar bone-deep chill swept through the hall. For a fraction of a second, the shadows around Lord Valerius seemed to deepen, to coalesce into something solid and protective. And then he was simply gone. It was not a trick of the light. There was no puff of smoke, no hidden passage. One moment he stood there, a defiant old man surrounded by armored guards. The next, the space he occupied was empty. The guards stumbled forward, grasping at nothing, their faces masks of stunned confusion. A woman screamed, the sound short and sharp before being choked off by her own terror. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. The king stood rigid on the dais, his mouth slightly agape, all his rage rendered impotent. His order had been issued, his power demonstrated, and yet his target had vanished into thin air, seemingly spirited away by the very forces he denied existed. The defiance had not been crushed, it had been magnified, transformed from the act of a single brave man into something supernatural and utterly beyond the king's control. The fear in the room curdled into something darker, something absolute. If the walls could whisper and the earth could blight, then they could also steal a man from under the king's very nose. Lord Valerius was not in a cell. He was somewhere else, and his mysterious vanishing act was a more powerful accusation than any words could ever be. The twilight was a thief, stealing the sharp edges of the world and leaving behind a landscape of soft, deceptive grays and purples. In the palace gardens, where Queen Isolde had once found her only solace, the evening air was thick with the cloying perfume of night-blooming jasmine and the damp scent of turned earth. The meticulously manicured hedges cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to twitch and breathe in the failing light. It was in this liminal hour, between the death of day and the birth of night, that the first sighting occurred. A young gardener, gathering his tools to depart, froze mid-motion. His eyes, accustomed to the shapes and shadows of his domain, caught a movement that was utterly wrong. Near the queen's favorite marble bench, nestled between two ancient weeping willows, a figure stood. It was tall and graceful, clad in a gown that seemed woven from the very twilight itself, a shifting, silvery gray. The posture was unmistakably regal, the head held high, the line of the shoulders achingly familiar. The gardener's breath hitched in his throat. He knew that silhouette had seen it 1,000 times moving through these same gardens in the sunlight. It was the queen, or a perfect, terrifying echo of her. He dropped his trowel, the clatter against the flagstone path unnaturally loud in the hush. The figure did not startle, simply turned its head, and though the features were blurred by distance and shadow, he felt the weight of its gaze upon him, a cold, profound sadness that pierced him to his soul. Then, as if dissolving into the gathering dark, it was gone. The space between the willows was empty. The gardener fled, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind screaming with a terror that was beyond reason. His incoherent babbling reached a captain of the guard, who, pale-faced, relayed the story to the king. Theron was in his solar, attempting to drown the whispers of the day in strong wine. The report struck him like a physical blow. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor and splattering the hem of his robe with blood-red droplets. The cold, controlled mask he had fought to maintain shattered completely. His face drained of all color, and a violent, uncontrollable tremor seized his hands. He saw it in his mind's eye, not a trick of the light, not a superstitious fool's mistake, but her, his mother, standing in her garden, the place of her only peace. Her presence now a condemnation woven into the very air. A raw, guttural order tore from his throat. The palace was to be locked down immediately. Every door barred, every gate sealed. No one was to enter or leave. Guards were to search every corner, every closet, every shadowed alcove. His voice was high and cracked with a panic he could no longer conceal. The command echoed through the stone corridors, a frantic, desperate attempt to cage a ghost. The search was thorough and terrifying. Armed men with torches swept through the gardens, their light creating frantic, dancing shadows that seemed to mock their efforts. They scoured the hedgerows, peered under benches, thrust their blades into dense thickets. They searched the silent, chilly halls of the palace, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. They found nothing. No trace of an intruder, no scrap of silver-gray fabric, no footprint on the damp earth. There was only the oppressive silence, the lingering chill, and the growing, unshakable certainty in every searcher's heart that the king's orders were not just futile but sacrilegious. They were not hunting an intruder. They were trying to arrest a memory, and the memory had already won. The sightings did not cease with the failed lockdown. They multiplied, each one more brazen and unnerving than the last. The spectral queen was no longer a fleeting shadow in the twilight garden. She was seen gliding through the moonlit corridors of the palace itself, a silent, silver-gray apparition that seemed to drift an inch above the cold marble floors. Servants, too terrified to sleep, reported seeing her standing at the end of long hallways, her form backlit by the moon through a high window, her head tilted as if listening to the very whispers of the stone. She was spotted in the empty throne room, a faint, shimmering outline seated upon the very throne Theron had stolen, a silent, judgmental occupant of his seat of power. But it was the words that truly unhinged the court. The whispers from the walls, once fragmented and melodic, now coalesced into clear, chilling warnings. A lady in waiting, fleeing down a darkened passage, swore the ghostly figure had turned and spoken directly to her, its voice a hollow echo from a deep well. "The crown is a serpent," it had sighed, the words carrying the scent of grave soil and wilted roses. A guardsman, standing his post at the entrance to the royal apartments, heard a whisper from an empty archway above him.
"Ice.
"He feeds the roots with poison, and they will strangle him." The warnings were not threats of violence, but pronouncements of inevitable doom, spoken with the calm, terrible certainty of a truth already written. For Theron, the constant, ethereal presence became an exquisite torture. He felt her everywhere. The air in his chambers grew so cold his breath plumed before him, carrying the faint, ghostly scent of her perfumed jasmine and sorrow. In the periphery of his vision, a shift of silver-gray fabric would vanish the moment he turned his head. The silence of the night was now filled with the sound of her absence, the rustle of a gown that was in tea there, the sigh of breath that did not stir the air. He took to having guards in his room, but their presence was useless against a haunt that existed in the very atmosphere. They saw nothing, heard nothing, but they felt the crushing dread, and they watched their king unravel before them. His sanity, already stretched taut by nightmares and the blight upon his land, began to fray at the edges. He would startle at nothing, his eyes wide and wild, spinning around to confront empty corners. His speech, once so controlled and calculated, became fragmented, laced with a desperate, paranoid energy. He accused shadows of conspiracy, ranted at the cold drafts that swept his rooms, and spent hours staring into the polished surface of his shield, as if expecting to see her reflection staring back. The crown on his head felt less like gold and more like a band of ice, forged in the chill of her perpetual, accusing presence. He was no longer just a king haunted by his crime. He was a man being slowly, methodically erased by a ghost, his every moment policed by the silent, sorrowful eyes of the mother he had murdered. The blight had drawn its stark, unforgiving line across the kingdom, border of rot and ruin that mapped the loyalty of every lord and province. In the sun-scorched southern plains and the fertile river valleys, whose banners had flown for Theron at his coronation, the earth lay fallow and stinking, the silence broken only by the lowing of starving cattle and the desperate prayers of starving people. Their granaries were empty, their hopes withered on the stalk. The curse was no longer a whispered rumor in a drafty palace. It was a daily, grinding reality of hunger and despair, and its source sat upon a throne of ice in the capital. From the unblighted north, where the old loyalties to Isolde ran as deep as mountain roots, the call to arms began. It started not with a declaration of war, but with a silent mustering. Lord Kellen, whose highland fortresses had remained untouched by the strange decay, sent out riders not with scrolls, but with a single blighted ear of wheat, passed from hand to hand. The message was unmistakable. The land itself had chosen its side. The king was cursed, his rule a poison in the soil. To follow him was to choose famine and death. The response was a tide. Minor lords whose fields had blackened, whose people looked to them with hollow-eyed accusation, renounced their oaths to the crown. They gathered their remaining men at terms, their faces set with a grim resolve born of necessity. They were not marching for conquest, but for survival, to tear out the rotten heart of the kingdom so the land might heal. Their forces coalesced into a ragged but determined army, its banners a mix of defiant sigils flying alongside the personal standard of Lord Kellenna, Silverhawk, on a field of blue, the same blue Isolde had always favored. News of the gathering rebellion reached the capital like a plague in its own right, carried by breathless, terrified messengers. Theron received the reports in his freezing throne room, his face a rigid mask of fury. But the fear that flickered in his eyes was new. He issued commands, his voice sharp and brittle, ordering his own forces to march and crush the insurrection. Yet as the commands left his lips, he saw the hesitation in the faces of his own captains. He bowed and accepted their orders, but their eyes did not meet his. They had seen the blight, they had heard the whispers. They had families in the city who whispered of the Shadow Queen. This wavering loyalty was not confined to the officers. Among the ranks of the palace guards, the men who stood watch over the haunted corridors, a subtle shift occurred. Their salutes were a fraction slower, their postures less rigid. They still obeyed, their training and fear of immediate punishment too ingrained to do otherwise. But the unquestioning allegiance was gone. When they patrolled the cold, whispering halls, their gazes now lingered on the empty spaces where the Queen's specter was said to walk. They protected a king they feared, in a palace haunted by the Queen they had loved, and the conflict was etched into their weary, apprehensive faces. The revolt had begun not just in the provinces, but in the very heart of Theron's power, in the silent, fearful doubt of the men who held his walls. The first crack in his foundation had appeared, and it was widening with every whispered warning and every report of a new lord joining the rebels. The rebellion at the gates was a distant thunder, a problem of steel and strategy that Theron could, in some detached part of his mind, still comprehend. But the siege within his own mind was a far more intimate and devastating warfare. Barricaded in his private chambers, the king was a prisoner not of stone and mortar, but of memory. The world outside, the shouts of captains, the clang of arms, the ominous silence of his own guards faded into a dull roar, drowned out by the screaming clarity of the past. The faint floral ghost of his mother's perfume, which had haunted the air for weeks, now thickened, becoming a tangible presence. It was the perfume she had worn the night of the feast. The scent that had clung to her as she'd smiled at him and drunk the poison. The air in the room grew heavy with it, sweet and suffocating. Then the walls, the tapestries, the very air seemed to shimmer. The present dissolved. He was back in her chambers. Not as an observer, but as a participant, trapped in a waking nightmare. He saw her not as the spectral queen of recent sightings, but as she was in her final moments pale, sweat-sheened, her body contorted with an agony he had delivered. Her eyes, wide and accusing, locked onto his from across the years. He could hear the ragged, wet sound of her breathing, see the tremor in her hand as she tried to push herself up. The memory was no longer a recollection. It was a reality playing out around him with horrifying vividness. He could smell the sickness on her, the sour temps of pain, and the cloying sweetness of the poison, more potent than any perfume. A raw animal sound tore from his throat. stumbled backward, his hands flying to his ears as if to block out the sound of her dying breaths, but it was inside his skull. He spun around, his wild eyes landing on the one thing in the room that offered a target for his rising panic. The portrait. It was a large, masterful painting of Queen Isolde in her prime. Her gaze serene and kind, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. That smile now seemed the most monstrous mockery. With a guttural cry, he lunged. His fingers, claw-like, ripped at the canvas, tearing through the painted image of her face. He shredded the serene eyes, the gentle smile, gouging the linen with his nails, until the portrait was a ruin of frayed threads and splintered wood. The destruction fueled his frenzy. He moved through his chambers like a storm, seeking out every reminder. A smaller miniature on his desk encased in silver, he smashed it against the stone hearth, grinding the glass and painted ivory under his heel. A tapestry depicting her coronation, he hauled it from the wall, his muscles straining, and threw it into the fire, watching the flames consume her woven likeness with a savage satisfaction. But when the last image was destroyed, when the room was littered with the wreckage of her memory, the siege did not lift. It intensified. The scent of her perfume remained, thicker than ever, and her eyes, those accusing, dying eyes, were everywhere. They stared at him from the swirling grain of the wooden table, from the patterns in the crushed velvet of his chair, from the dancing flames in the fireplace. They were in the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room, unblinking, full of a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest. I could not escape her gaze. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, and the only occupant was the ghost of the mother he had killed. Her silent condemnation, a more effective prison than any rebel army could ever build. The walls were not just whispering anymore. They were watching, and they would not let him forget. The thunder was no longer distant. The siege of memories within Theron's mind was violently eclipsed by the siege of the present, a cacophony of war that vibrated through the very stones of the palace. The air, once thick with phantom perfume and dread, now choked on the acrid stench of smoke and the metallic temps of fear. Shouts of captains, the clash of steel, and the screams of the dying echoed through corridors that had only known whispers. His guards, their loyalty frayed to a single, desperate thread, fought a losing battle at every barricade, their hearts no longer in the defense of a cursed king. Theron stood in the center of the vast, empty throne room, a figure of splendid isolation. The crown, that band of ice, was jammed upon his brow. He would drown the whispers in blood, silence the accusations with steel. With a final deafening crash, the great doors at the far end of the hall burst inward. Rebels poured into the throne room, a tide of grim-faced men. They fanned out, a semicircle of bristling weapons and hatred, their advance slowing as they took in the solitary figure before the throne. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise of battle, a held breath before the final blow. He would speak. He would rally some final, defiant curse against these traitors, these fools who dared challenge his divine right. The words died in his throat. His eyes, fixed on the rebels, caught a movement behind them. Behind his throne, where the shadows were deepest, the air began to shimmer like heat haze on a desert plain. It thickened, drawing substance from the cold and the darkness, from the collective fear and hope in the room. Queen Isolde, not the dying woman of his nightmares, but the queen in her full majesty, her face a mask of sorrow and terrible judgment. Her spectral gaze was fixed solely on her son, a silent, unbearable accusation made manifest in the heart of his power. The ghostly image stood behind the throne he had killed to possess, the ultimate witness to his final, desperate stand. The haunting was over. She had come for her reckoning. The rebels, the sword in his hand, the very crown on his head, all of it vanished from his perception. The world shrank to the spectral figure standing behind his throne, her silent gaze a vortex that sucked all reason from his mind. The carefully constructed walls of his lies, his ambition, his rage crumbled into dust under that terrible, sorrowful scrutiny. The ghost did not speak, did not move. But her presence was an avalanche of truth, crushing the last vestiges of his sanity. A raw, primal scream ripped from Theron's throat, a sound of such profound agony and denial that it froze the advancing rebels in their tracks. It was the scream of the boy caught in a terrible act, not the roar of a king. He was no longer a monarch defending his throne. but a child confessing to his mother in the desperate, futile hope for a forgiveness he knew would never come. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the shimmering apparition, his eyes wide and unseeing. "You," he shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "It was for you, all of it. Your cautious peace, your weakling counsels. You would have let our house crumble to dust. I saved it. I saved us." The confession echoed in the silent throne room, each word a hammer blow against the ears of the stunned rebels. They watched, aghast, as the king they had come to depose unraveled before them, admitting to the regicide they had only suspected. He was not speaking to them, but to the empty air behind the throne, to a memory made manifest by his own guilt. His confession spent, a new madness took hold. A wild, desperate light gleamed in his eyes. If he could not have her forgiveness, he would have her destruction. With another incoherent cry, he lunged not at the rebels, but past them, toward the empty space behind the gilded throne. As he moved, a strange stillness fell over the room. The massive iron chandelier hanging high above the throne, a masterpiece of black metal, and countless candles that had illuminated generations of royalty, gave a sudden, sharp groan. It was a sound of shearing metal, utterly unnatural, as if an immense, unseen hand had twisted its central fastening. There was no draft, no structural weakness, no logical reason for it to fail. Not in a slow, swinging arc, but in a direct, plummeting descent, as if guided with pinpoint accuracy. It dropped from the shadowed heights of the ceiling like a comet of iron and fire, its fall perfectly timed to the king's frenzied lunge. The impact was a cataclysm of sound, a deafening crash of metal, the explosive shatter of 1,000 pieces of crystal, and a single, abruptly cut-off cry. The throne room floor shook. When the dust settled, the rebels could only stare in horrified silence. The king lay buried beneath the monstrous weight of the iron fixture, his crown visible amidst the wreckage, twisted and crushed. The throne he had murdered for stood untouched behind him, scarred but intact, and the space behind it was empty. The air no longer shimmered. The scent of jasmine was gone. The silence that followed the chandelier's fall was heavier than the iron that now lay in a twisted heap upon the throne room floor. It was a silence of shock, of released tension, of dreadful finality. For a long moment the rebels simply stood, their weapons slack in their hands, their fierce resolve replaced by a numb, almost reverent horror. They had come for a battle, for justice, for retribution. They had not expected to witness a judgment so precise, so absolute, that it felt less like a victory and more like an execution performed by the very stones of the palace. Slowly, cautiously, they moved forward. Lord Kellen was the first to approach the wreckage. He did not need to look long. A single jeweled hand, limp and pale, protruded from beneath the carnage, the signet ring of the king glinting dully in the dusty light. The crown, that symbol of stolen power and unleashed curse, was visible too, not resting on a brow, but crushed and pinned beneath a strut of black iron, its gold twisted into a meaningless shape. There was no need to check for a pulse. The air itself seemed to declare the king's reign over. The rebels fanned out, securing the chamber. Disarming the few remaining guards, who offered no resistance, their will to fight extinguished with their master. The palace was theirs. The usurper was dead. The great doors were thrown open, and word began to spread through the city, a ripple of disbelief, then tentative relief, then a swelling, cautious hope. The long shadow of Theron's rule had been lifted, but as the initial shock faded, a new, colder reality began to seep into the victorious silence. The rebels, now the temporary stewards of the realm, expected a change. They waited for the oppressive chill that had clung to the palace for months to dissipate. They listened for the cessation of the whispers in the walls. They looked to the high, stained-glass windows, expecting the gray, sickly light to be replaced by the clear, honest sun of a new day. The change did not come. The chill remained, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the stone. It was not the chill of a neglected building, but the same active, watchful cold that had plagued Theron's reign. In the quiet moments between the sounds of securing the palace, the faint, melodic hum returned, a sorrowful lullaby drifting from an empty corridor. The air still carried, for those who remembered, the faintest hint of jasmine and grief. A messenger, his face etched with the exhaustion of a hard ride, was brought before Lord Kellen in the throne room. He brought news from the blighted provinces. The reports were the same. The fields remained blackened and dust-dry. The livestock continued to sicken and die. The earth had not miraculously healed with the king's death. The curse had not been a chain tied solely to Theron's life. It was a stain he had allowed to be spilled, and it had soaked into the very fabric of the land. The bitter truth settled over the victors with the weight of the fallen iron chandelier. They had secured the palace. They had ended the tyrant. But they had not broken the curse. Isolda's final wrath, they realized with a dawning, awful clarity, had never been just about her son's betrayal. It was a condemnation of the act itself, a poison that had infected the kingdom's soul. Her vengeance was not satisfied with a single death, demanded a perpetual remembrance, an eternal atonement. The crown they had fought to liberate was not a prize to be won, but a burden of ice and sorrow, and the land itself would remain a monument to her tragedy until that debt was paid. Their victory was hollow, their new dawn a twilight. The tragedy had not ended. It had only deepened, its roots now buried far beyond the reach of any mortal sword.